Good afternoon and welcome to the Guernsey Disability Alliance's members meeting. Not only have we got members in the room here at Les Cotils, but we also have members and colleagues or partners on the live stream. So I will be trying to work between the two today. So my name's Karen Blanchford. I've been in the Guernsey Disability Alliance for 5 years. I mostly do our partnership and members side, and we have a social policy team that we will social policy team that works on the legislation side. So what today is all about is introducing you to Employment Social Security, or the committee of, which we've been involved with for the last term since they took over from Policy Council. It's been for all of us a long and difficult journey, but fortunately with ESS this has been the end of 13 years of campaigning. This is how long some of our members, for some people in this room, it's been a lifetime of campaigning for equality of opportunity. So we feel your pain, but I think we feel like there's certainly some light at the end of the tunnel. And we're going to hear from Deputy Michelle Leclerc and Deputy Emily McSwiggan in a moment about where those proposals are at. Also in the room we have Employment Social Security staff. So I don't know, Ellen, if it's all right to put your hand up, and Ellen and Sarah, as well as Malcolm. Good. It's all right. Yeah, there you go, Ed. Promotion. Thank you, Ed Ashton. And of course our founder, Rob Platts, who we'll hear from later. So the format for today is that we are going to go into a slide presentation. That's an opportunity for us all to get up to speed. Those slides will be online, as will this Facebook video. If you are on listening now, please note that you can turn on auto sub captions, so you can get the captions along the bottom. They're not always that accurate, so for anyone listening in, please bear with us. What will happen is the video of today will go up on our website in between 24 to 36 hours, and it will have been edited. So for anyone using subtitles or captioning, that's probably your best place to go to our website, www.gda.org.gg. So without sort of further ado, I'm just going to pass you over, and while Deputy Leclerc and McSwiggan are talking, maybe just have a think about the fact that there will be a whole half an hour of question time. You can ask questions in the chat online, and you can ask questions in the room. So as we hear from them through the presentation, please have a think about what it is that you want to ask during the question time at the end. Thank you.
I've got a little stool here. Thank you for that introduction, Karen, and thank you for inviting the committee here today. Some of you have already attended our presentation, so there will be some repeat of that presentation, but we'll try and canter through it because I think really your questions are really, really important to us. So if we go on to slide 2, so July 2019, the committee published draft policy proposals for a new discrimination ordinance covering 10 grounds of protection. And we did have a fantastic response to the consultation, receiving well over 1,000 responses. And a report setting out the findings of the consultation is available on our website, gov.gg discrimination consultation. So having carefully considered the consultation feedback and after continued engagement with representatives of the GDA, Equality Guernsey and the business associations, the committee decided to revise its proposals in a number of areas. So the 2nd of March 2020, the committee published a policy letter setting out its final policy proposals for discrimination. Now we hoped that we would have debated these proposals in April, but unfortunately the pandemic has meant that we've had to delay that, but we are now scheduled for, well, subject to approval this afternoon, hopefully, I'm looking across at Emily, for debate on the 15th of July. Now, if we don't get to that debate on the 15th of July, there'll probably be another rollover date in July, or we'll go to the August debate, which is the 19th of August. But I hope that it'll be high up on the agenda. So in summary, the committee is now proposing a phased development of the discrimination ordinance, covering the multiple grounds. And if the proposed legislation is brought in, people will be protected from all forms of discrimination when applying for a job, at work, and contexts relating to work. As a consumer, so when you're accessing goods or services, shopping, going to a bank or socialising, when using public services, buying, leasing or renting a property, when joining a member of a club or association, and in time but not immediately in education. The committee is proposing the expansion of the employment relations services to become an employment and equal opportunities service, and the expansion and development of the existing employment and discrimination tribunal. But we'll go into detail of those two bodies later in the presentation. So I'd just like to clarify that when the states were debating the policy proposals and the supporting services to administer the legislation, the states won't actually be debating the legislation in July. It will be the proposals that will form the legislation that will follow. So it's what I've got here, if the proposals, I'm going to be positive and say when the proposals are approved by the states, the legislation will need to be prioritised for drafting. And again, we'll be pushing, we will no longer be committee members, but I'm sure the next committee will be pushing for that drafting to take place and have some priority. This is proposed by the Policy and Resources Committee, that prioritisation, but it'll need to be approved by the states. So we would hope that the legislation will come into force in 2022. So it will give businesses and organisations time to prepare. So, in Guernsey at the moment, our existing legislation only protects people from discrimination at work on the grounds of sex, gender reassignment and marriage. So our proposal set out in the policy letter, phase 1, we're proposing that disability, and that's why we're here seeing you today, carer status, again another really important status, and I know it's something that you've all campaigned for, and race are included in phase 1 of the legislation. And I think I just want to emphasise that race is included in phase 1, but that was something that we had put into phase 1 before the things that have happened over the last few weeks. So it's not as a result of that was already a proposal in phase 1. I think that's really important. I was on the radio recently and they asked me that and I said no, it was always in phase 1. So the other grounds of protection will be added in future. So in time we'll have a single anti-discrimination covering multiple grounds of protection. It was unfortunate. We would like to have done all the work and brought in every phased ground at the same time, but because of the pushback that we did have on the definition of disability, really from last October, I would say, when we had the consultation findings, it has taken a significant amount of our time to actually reach a compromise. And I must say that it's on the part of the GDA that has actually compromised the most. But we were faced with having probably no legislation at all. So there has been compromise, and again we'll go into that in more detail, and that is why we've been left with having to phase in, because actually we just did not have the time then to write the policy paper covering all the protected grounds. So phase 2, we're looking at protecting age and religion, and in phase 3, sexual orientation would be added. The existing sex discrimination ordinance would also need to be repealed, and the grounds currently included would be brought into the new ordinance with possible changes. And the committee has signalled an intention to recommend in phase 3 the development of ordinance, the introduction of the right to equal pay for work of equal value in respect of sex. And again, that was something that actually the states themselves, they've done a piece of work, and that would come at huge significant cost. And businesses had asked us if we could look to phase in that, because they would need additional time. I think if I go on to slide 4 and 5, the committee's proposals have changed a lot in response to the consultation feedback. However, there are many elements that have not changed, in particular the different types of unlawful discrimination and when different treatment can be lawful. So you'll remember that these kinds of actions that will be forbidden under the new law. Is that my phone? Oh. Hope not. Oh, I'll leave it. So types of unlawful discrimination: direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, discrimination by association, discrimination arising from disability, and denial of a reasonable adjustment. And other prohibited conduct: harassment, sexual harassment, discriminatory advertisements, victimisation, instructions or pressure to commit a prohibited act, and failing to provide equal pay for equal work. You'll also remember that there are a number of circumstances in which it'd be lawful to treat people differently. And I'll run through the list quickly. As we explained these concepts in more depth at a previous meeting. But if you've got any questions on this, then please feel free to ask us afterwards. But it's important to be clear that the concept of discrimination is tied closely to the protected grounds. That is race, disability and carer status in phase 1. So if an employer or service provider treats someone differently for reasons unrelated to those grounds, like for example making employment decisions based on how qualified a person is, it won't count as direct discrimination. The committee is proposing that positive action should be permitted but not required. So positive action is basically taking positive measures with a view to achieving full equality in practice. It's also possible that for some forms of discrimination, and that's not direct discrimination, employers and goods or service providers may be able to objectively justify their actions by demonstrating that it is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Similarly, there's nothing in the committee's proposals that would oblige an employer to hire or retain somebody who can't do the essential functions of a role. And I think that's sometimes misunderstood. The law might prompt an employer to think more carefully about what's essential and what's merely desirable, or what could be done differently. And I think actually I know people are disappointed that we didn't take the policy paper in April, but I think actually through COVID, we've actually seen that businesses can make reasonable adjustments. People have made reasonable adjustments. And I think when we're in the Assembly, it's going to be much easier for people to understand that those adjustments, some of them are only small adjustments, but have made a significant difference to people participating in a work environment. So actually the delay, I hope, will give us a stronger argument in some of these arguments. And we've had to change the terminology as well to reasonable adjustments, so we conceded on that one. So as well as the concept of objective justification, our proposal includes a set of well-defined exceptions. Again, this is fairly common in anti-discrimination laws around the world. Exceptions provide for circumstances where it is legitimate to treat people differently, even based on the protected grounds. As mentioned previously, the 3 grounds of protection that a committee has recommended: race, carer status and disability. The definitions of the ground of protection are really important in anti-discrimination laws as they determine who is protected by the legislation. And as I say, the committee recommends that race would include colour, descent, nationality, ethnic origins and national origins. And they were in our phase 1 prior to what has happened recently. So definition of carer status. We've proposed that a person would have carer status if they provide care or support in a non-professional capacity on a continuing, regular or frequent basis for a close relative or a person that they live with, or who has a disability which is such a nature as to give rise to the need for that level of care and support. And I think, am I passing over to Emily? I am on definition of disability. over my stool.
Of course, the definition of disability is going to be the one that you will have been watching most closely and will be most invested in. And Mish acknowledged that there was a willingness to negotiate and compromise from the GDA, which we didn't experience to the same extent from any other partner in the development of these proposals, and which we are immensely grateful for and appreciative of, because it has enabled us to get a piece of legislation to the states. But in saying that, we recognise that it has left you as the GDA with concerns about whether what we are proposing might go far enough. So I want to explain what we have changed and why we have kept some things that are very important to us, and that we will continue to defend against possible challenges when it comes to the states. So the definition of disability includes, a person would fall into the protected ground if they have one or more long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments. And an impairment would be considered to be long-term if it had lasted or was expected to last for not less than 6 months or until the end of the person's life. And that requirement for a disability, an impairment to be long-term, and that long-term period to be defined as at least 6 months, is the same as it is in Jersey. And importantly, that definition wouldn't exclude relapsing or recurring conditions, even when a person is in a period of remission. And it wouldn't exclude conditions where treatment is controlling the effect of the condition. So it is perhaps broader than it looks on the face of it. But although we are more similar to Jersey in that respect than we were at the outset of our consultation, we are proposing some differences from Jersey, which we think are absolutely vital. So we are proposing that impairment is defined in a way it isn't in Jersey, but in a way that it is in places like Ireland, Australia and Hong Kong. And this is intended to provide more clarity for everyone about what an impairment is. So it's not just left up to the judgment of courts or tribunals who may or may not have a great deal of experience or personal understanding of disability to try and negotiate their way through where the law applies and where it does not. We have clarified that if the existence of a condition, impairment or illness is in doubt, it will be possible to provide medical or other expert evidence. And we have, where Jersey has in its definition of disability certain exclusions, so things like a tendency to set fire, which I think is also an exclusion in the UK. They say, well, it's not a disability. Well, it's not. But it's also a mistake to tangle all that up with the definition of disability, because then you start, in your head, you start mixing up the idea of disabled people and people who commit crimes and so on. And actually, what we've said is, no, we're going to treat those completely separately. There are a set of exemptions under the law where you wouldn't be entitled to protection from discrimination, and that includes if you commit criminal acts against people or property. And I mean that's very straightforward common sense. It should never have been tangled up in the definitions in the first place, and we are absolutely doing the right thing by keeping them separately. And finally, and most importantly, we haven't included an impact on functioning test in the definition. This is uncommon in laws internationally, but it does exist in Jersey's law. And we anticipate that between now and the debate, the committee is going to come under some pressure to adopt the Jersey legislation. And we are very firm in our position that it would be wrong to have this test in place where you as a disabled person might have to prove the impact of the disability on your own life before you are entitled to seek any protection under the law. We think that is completely wrong and unfounded, and it stops the law short of providing the kind of protection that it's designed to provide. And this is reflected in comment from the international bodies who have said persons victimised by disability-based discrimination who are seeking legal redress should not be burdened by proving that they are disabled enough in order to benefit from the protection of the law. Anti-discrimination law that is disability inclusive seeks to outlaw and prevent a discriminatory act rather than target a defined protected group. So a broad impairment-related definition of disability, akin to the one that we have proposed, is more in line with the convention, certainly, than one that has that impact of functioning test. We have made some proposals in respect of accessibility and recognise that education providers and providers of goods and services will need some time to consider what adaptations they may need to make to infrastructure or buildings. So we are proposing, in terms of how the law works, that if you have a discrimination complaint which relates to a physical feature of a building, so something that is physically inaccessible and may need to change in order for you to be included, you will be able to start taking those complaints 5 years after the main body of the law comes into force. So that's a transition period of 5 years, in effect, before you can take complaints about physical accessibility. We know that in Jersey, they allowed a transition period of 2 years for physical features. But we also know that whereas we are pushing for disability discrimination to be one of the very first grounds of protection of our law, Jersey left it to the end. So they had gone through a process with their community of introducing non-discrimination on various different grounds. They finally came to include disability discrimination, and at the end of that very long journey, they said, and you know, here is your ability to act on physical features. So because this is nearer the start of the journey for you know, businesses and service providers, if not those of you here, we are allowing more of a transition period for them to get used to it. We have removed the anticipatory accessibility duty because we received legal advice in the course of our consultation that it was unnecessary and it would potentially cause confusion. But we are proposing, and this will work similarly to the way that the law works in the UK, that the reasonable adjustment duty, which Mish has already talked about, will apply to disabled people in general in the context of education and goods and service providers. So this will mean that education providers and providers of goods and services, whether shops or cafes or anything else, will need to think about the needs of disabled people and how they're going to adjust what they do in order to meet those needs in advance of people having to ask. So in effect, it will be its own form of anticipatory duty. We have, however, still recommended that there should be a specific duty on public sector goods, services and education providers. And that duty will be to prepare accessibility action plans in respect of the public-facing aspects of their services. And again, they're going to need to do that within that first 5-year transition period. There are a few areas where that's not going to apply. So in respect of ancient monuments, for example, where no other service is provided. So something like one of the forts or castles where there's also a visitor information service, you would have to think about how you're going to make that accessible. But if it's a dolmen and you know it's just a dolmen that you go and visit and there's nothing much you can do to make the dolmen more accessible, that there won't be a duty to change that. But the general aim of this duty is to help the public sector to plan and improve accessibility over time, and to be ready, hopefully not to need to defend any disability discrimination complaints because the work will have started in advance. And we hope that that's going to make a big difference to people's lives because the public sector provides so many central services. But we also hope it's going to act as a kind of exemplar because it won't be mandatory for other providers of goods and services to do the same. But we will be encouraging them to do so. We'll be showing in the public service how it can be done. And we are planning to commission some accessibility consultancy, specifically so that we can support small organisations who want advice on how to sensibly prioritise or address access issues that they've identified. So if the law is introduced, we need to talk about what action people will be able to take if they feel they've been discriminated against. And the process that we have set out starts with somebody raising the matter with their employer or service provider. So we said at all stages through the consultation, our aim is to make this a piece of law that helps to create an inclusive community. And you start by trying to resolve everything at the most informal level possible. So you start, if you can, by having a conversation with your employer or having a conversation with the person you're accessing goods or services from. And we know that some employers and some businesses will be quick to address issues brought to their attention, and there'll be no need to move on to more formal steps under the proposed law. We think that taking a case to a formal hearing needs to be a last resort. And ideally, we want people to be given advice and guidance so they understand what discrimination is if they're providing a service and how to avoid it. Because although sometimes discrimination is overt, and I think we'll all have had experiences of that, it's also often unintentional. And that's where education and awareness raising comes in and can make a powerful change. But if discrimination does happen, we want to ensure that there are ways to help people resolve the issue as soon and as informally as possible. And we are trying to balance that naturally against making sure that cases are taken seriously and making sure that there are good outcomes that work for everyone. One of the reasons why we emphasise informal resolution is not only because it's more cost effective, but it's better for everybody involved in most circumstances, as it's less confrontational, it's faster, and it can often come to a more personalised resolution. So we will be offering free advice and pre-complaint conciliation, and that's to try and help people resolve issues before a formal complaint is registered. And we are going to be proposing to develop the existing employment relations service, which most of you I think will know of, into the Employment and Equal Opportunities Service. And that service will be responsible for delivering this. They will be led by a statutory official, and that will help to ensure that there is some operational independence in terms of the way complaints are handled, because we recognise the public sector, as much as anyone else, is likely to face complaints. But if someone's not happy with how an informal complaint has been responded to, they will be able to register a formal complaint. In general, the timeline is 3 months from the alleged discrimination to the point of registering a complaint. But if you have sought pre-complaint conciliation, the stuff that the informal resolution I've just talked about, don't worry, the clock stops for that period. So we don't, if you're making an effort to resolve it informally, that is not counting against your opportunity to take a formal complaint if you need to. We are proposing to expand the existing Employment and Discrimination Tribunal to hear complaints under this law. And we have chosen a tribunal route rather than things having to go through the courts, because it is generally less intimidating and more accessible to people. Because there is already a tribunal, there are already processes, so we will be continuing to use and develop those processes, including registering a complaint with the secretary of the tribunal, having the offer of conciliation, which is usually provided by staff working for what will be the Employment and Equal Opportunities Service. And then if the conciliation process doesn't work, or if either party doesn't want to participate in conciliation, cases can go forward to tribunal. And the way the tribunal works at the moment, cases are heard by 3 people who are selected from a larger panel of people who are the tribunal in large. And they are all trained to be able to reach fair judgments on the matters that come before them. And we are proposing, in order to strengthen the work of the tribunal, that in future the chair of any hearing will have to be legally qualified, although the other 2 people who will sit on that hearing won't have to be legally qualified. So it will be a blend of legal understanding and sort of lay experience and expertise. We recognise that this is an area of law that is complicated, and we think that the additional legal skills will be valuable and fair to everyone who's involved. There was some concern that vexatious or frivolous complaints might be made under the law, as I think there always is when a new law is introduced. And in line with that, we've introduced new powers for the tribunal to be able to strike out complaints. And these powers are not unique to Guernsey. They are the same powers that employment tribunals in the UK also have. But if the tribunal finds that there has been a case of discrimination, harassment or victimisation, then they will be able to order financial compensation or order a non-financial remedy, which might, for example, include a requirement for someone to undergo training, or a direction that somebody has to make a reasonable adjustment in the way they employ somebody or in the way they provide a service. And again, I just want to stress that the aim of this law is to try and create an inclusive and accessible community. And being able to order non-financial remedies, ways of practically making things right, rather than solely financial compensation, is a really important part of being able to do this. In terms of the financial compensation available, the options are different depending on whether the complaint is related to employment or not. For employment, it's an award of up to 6 months' pay and then up to £10,000 for injury to feelings. And injury to feelings has been made out to be this thing that it isn't throughout the consultation. It's been, what if someone says they've got hurt feelings and then are they going to get all this money from the tribunal? It's not that at all, but we recognise that some cases of discrimination are so egregious, so cruel, so, repeated and ongoing and gradually chipping away at the dignity and the confidence of the people who experience them, that actually that does profound damage to the person who's on the receiving end of it. And it is right that people should be able to challenge that, and it is right that they should be able to seek compensation for that. In the case of complaints that aren't related to employment, the award would be up to £10,000 for financial loss. There are cases in which not being able to access a good or service or accessing it in a discriminatory way might result in a direct loss to you. And then again, a case up to £10,000 for injury to feelings in exactly the same circumstances as I've just described. We are planning to base that compensation on a scale which has a small number of bands, 3 bands, which is similar to the Vento scale that's used in the UK. So again, this is a sort of tried and tested approach to providing compensation in those schemes. Our compensation, the extent of the final financial compensation that people can potentially receive is not as great as it is in some other places. And one of the reasons for this is that we want to encourage cultural change, but certainly to begin with, we don't want to take a punitive approach while employers and service providers get used to the new legislation. So we recognise that this is new to everyone. Everybody's got a lot of learning to do. We don't, at this point in time, want it to be a big stick to wrap people over the knuckles with. We hopefully never want it to be a big stick to wrap people over the knuckles with, because hopefully we will be able to create the kind of inclusive culture that we're pushing for. But we know it's important to have it there as a backstop. And if evidence of how the law works in practice or how people's behaviours change in practice shows that it's necessary to adjust any part of the law, we will be doing a post-implementation review, and we will be able to take those kind of factors into account. I think the one thing that I just need to point out in respect to the tribunal is that we have left it open as to how complaints in respect of education will be judged. And the reason for that is that at the same time as we've been working up this law, the Education Committee have been working on a new education law. And we need to make sure that the two pieces of law hang together properly in terms of how complaints in the field of education are judged. So that is a loose end that will be tied up soon, but I need to point it out as a loose end as it stands and explain the reason why. In a lot of cases, discrimination in the workplace comes hand in hand with an experience of unfair dismissal. And if somebody wants to register a complaint of both unfair dismissal, and there are provisions under our existing laws which would allow them to do that, and discrimination, it would be possible for them to do so, and for the tribunal to hear both sets of complaints at the same time. And I'm not going to try and talk through the table on the slide right now. So Karen has said the slides will be available afterwards, and it's probably more complex than I could do justice to, but it shows the different set of outcomes that would be possible if one complaint is upheld and the other is not, or both are or both are not. If anybody wants to talk through that individually, then I'd be happy to do so later. But just moving on to what happens if, or as Mish said, when the proposals are approved by the states. This is how we intend phase 1 is going to be implemented. So in the rest of 2020, we hope work will begin on drafting the law, including amending existing laws which make the changes I've outlined to the tribunal. There will be guidance and training for employers and service providers on their new responsibilities. And we are also planning to carry out a prejudice and discrimination survey later in the year. And that's going to give us effectively a baseline in terms of where the community's attitudes and values stand right now on sort of day zero of the law coming into play. And in future years, we'll be able to look back on that and see if we can gauge how things have changed, because we will have that as a starting reference point. And Rob is giving me a glance, and I can't say that without crediting Rob, because Rob has pushed at every stage of the development of this law to make sure that we have got baseline information about people's attitudes and values, so that we can judge what progress or otherwise we have made over time. And then the second year, in 2021, the train year, We are expecting the law to return to the states for approval. Obviously, there will probably have been an election between now and then, and that will depend on the behaviours of the next committee. So don't take your eye off the ball just yet. That's still going to have to be followed through. But in 2021, it should come back to the states. We should be developing services to provide more conciliation and to manage and hear discrimination complaints. And we will be helping to train people up ready for the law to come into force the following year. So all being well, in 2022, the law will come into force. The protections on the ground of race, carer status and disability will be there, and people will be able to access the protections that they need to under that legislation. So just briefly, Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the law bring in additional grounds of protection, which Mish has discussed. We envisage that each of those phases will take about 2 years, and when we get to the end of that process, and again, please don't take your eye off the ball until the end of that process. It's a really important piece of work. We all need to sort of stand together and make sure that we get that we keep building until everyone is protected. But once that is done, we are proposing that there will be a post-implementation review. And if we see any issues arising in the course of implementing the law, in the course of developing subsequent phases, we won't hesitate to take action on that sooner if it's needed. We're not just going to push things off to some wonderful future date because we've said, okay, there's going to be a post-implementation review on that date. We will deal with things when they need to be dealt with.
And our promise to you is that we won't take our eye off the ball.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. So if you want to find out more, I think that when the slides are circulated, the links will still function. So you'll be able to click through to the policy letter, which is the first link. If you can't give the time to read what is it's a really well written policy letter. It's you know, for a piece of writing about a piece of complex law, it is one of the most straightforward policy letters I have had to read. But it's still big and it's still complicated and it takes a lot of time. And if you don't have that, there is a summary of proposals at the second link, and there is an easy read summary also at that link. There are 2 documents on the side of the screen which you'll be able to click on and download. And if you want to know any more, obviously you can contact the members of the committee directly, or you can contact our team via equality@gov.gg or on the telephone number on the slide. And I know that you have all waited a long, long time for these proposals, far too long for them to come about. And it might feel, oh, we're getting there, our work is nearly done. But it's really not the case. We still need to persuade at least 20 states members to vote in favour of these proposals for them to pass. Ideally, they will pass with an overwhelming majority, so no one can ever say this is not something that Guernsey doesn't want. But you need to know that we received strong pushback during the consultation from people who think discrimination doesn't happen in Guernsey, or from people who think that a law is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, or from people who think it just will cost too much to operate. And you know, those same arguments will come out in the context of, well, we've just had a pandemic and we're reeling from the results of that, and really, why do you want to do this now? Oh, and if you are going to do it, why not just lift what Jersey have done? And as I said when I started speaking, there are really strong reasons, disability reasons, not just to do what Jersey has done. And we will fight for that, and we need you to fight for that too. And if you can, between here and the debate on the 15th of July, please speak out about the need for this legislation. If you feel able to, please share your experience of life in Guernsey as a person with a disability or a carer. If you have faced unfair barriers which stopped you getting a job or accessing education or even going into a shop or restaurant, if you need reasonable adjustments to be fully included, if you can see other ways in which this law would make a real practical difference to your life, please share those. Share them with the people who are going to be making the decisions in a few weeks' time, and share them with the people who influence them. Speak to us, speak to your deputies as a whole, and make sure that deputies you speak to understand your perspective as the people this legislation is designed for. So thank you all very much, and I think it's over to questions now.
Can I just make one other comment?
Cool.
I just want to make the comment that there will be a huge pressure for us to have, there will be pressure from lots of sources to say, let's just go with the Jersey because you can have it all with the Jersey. But I just want to emphasise, the areas that we've said that we don't think are right in adopting the Jersey law, but the one big area that is missing from the Jersey law, and I know is really important to yourselves, is the carer status is not in the Jersey legislation. So we will be foregoing a lot of what you would want to be in that legislation if we just take the easy option of going for the Jersey law. So it may sound very, very persuasive from the outset. You can have it all, because that was the argument that was made to us many, many times when we met with other organisations. So just be very aware of that it sounds seductive, but actually there are some big gaps, and gaps that you in particular would really care about. So I just want to emphasise that point.
Thank you to both Deputy Michelle Leclerc and Deputy Emily McSwiggan. I just want to catch a little bit more on what Michelle just said. It's actually not the easy option. There's many laws or legislation that would need to change. It cut and paste of Jersey isn't that simple, unfortunately. So it may have been marketed as that, but it certainly isn't. So now it's over to you. We've got 20 minutes. We'll be taking questions from the floor. We've had some that have already been submitted, and we'll be taking questions online. If you're on Facebook Live, please write them in the chat. There's a little chat area on there, and Rob, one of my colleagues, is monitoring that. So joining both Emily and Michelle is Rob Platts, our founder. So Rob, if we can ask you. And Rob will need a microphone if he needs to speak. For everyone in the room, just a reminder, please, that when you speak, you'll have two microphones in your face, I'm afraid. One for the room and one for the recording. And if possible, I'll also try and put the questions back. So do we have any questions from in the room to start? Please do. Please raise anything that's on your mind, or any concerns or clarification. Oh, thank you. And the same, we were clear and precise. Ian, thank you.
Hi, Ian Timms. As far as restaurants, cafes and things are concerned, with the disability inclusion and everything, how will their licence be permitted if they haven't got any sort of disability facilities?
Is my mic enough?
Yes, I think so. Just, yeah.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
So you're asking about disability facilities. So do you mean accessible toilets and so on, or all sorts of accessible provision?
Well, access to the facility, but also disabled toilets within the facility as well. Will they still get a license to operate if they haven't got these facilities?
Okay, so this law won't directly doesn't directly result in a cafe or a restaurant being issued a license to operate. That's a completely separate piece of law, but this law will require them to do the kind of things that you've outlined. So it will require them to make sure that there is that their premises are as accessible as it's possible to make them. That there are disabled facilities within the premises, and if a business that could reasonably provide those facilities chooses not to, then it will be possible to challenge them under this law. And as I said, there are some specific remedies that the tribunal could say, you've got to go and do this. And one of the things the tribunal could do is go and say, you have got to go and make that reasonable adjustment, because it is reasonable. You know, you could afford it. You could straightforwardly make that change to your building or your practices. You just don't want to do it. And here is your direction to go and do it. It won't be possible for all businesses to make every change to be as accessible as possible. But where those opportunities exist and people simply choose not to make them, this law gives you an opportunity to challenge and change that.
Thank you.
At the back, Ellie.
This might not be relevant, I'm not sure, but I saw something on Facebook last night, so bear with me. And it just seemed like a really interesting question. So when somebody's claiming benefits, whether it's carer's allowance or disability benefit, somebody mentioned that maybe the definition of who was a carer and the definition of disability and how that's defined might actually contradict with each other. Now, I'm not sure if that was true, but it was an interesting question if they are at odds with each other as to what will happen with someone's benefits and their claims.
I can ask our officers, maybe. Does Ed know? Do you know, Ed?
Would you be able to give Ed the microphone if that's all right?
Or does Ellen know?
That one.
Thank you. Thank you. Really good question. And I'm on the spot. So I'm looking at Ellen. I don't actually think we've had that particular discussion with me. I think officers may have had that discussion and they've got the answer, I actually think.
Yes, I mean, the comment is right. It is likely that the definitions of disability will be different in relation to benefit entitlement as in relation to being able to make a disability discrimination claim. And whilst that might sound surprising or odd, it is actually logical, because you've got to look at what that law is seeking to achieve, what the aim of the law is, and therefore the definitions could be different. So, for example, in relation to carer's allowance, we sort of set a threshold of a level of care that is required and quite a high level of disability in order to be entitled to severe disability benefit. Whereas for discrimination legislation, we're wanting the definition to be very wide and inclusive. So it's actually capturing a different kind of group of people. So, and it is normal in other countries for legislation to contain different definitions depending on what the aim of the legislation is.
Okay, and I think Em just wants to come in.
If you think about all the different services and support that government provides to groups of disabled people, it very often is to groups, as Ellen said. So not everybody who would be covered by the ground of protection, the disability ground of protection in this law would, for example, be entitled to a blue badge, because a blue badge does specific things in terms of your mobility and your access needs, and that doesn't apply to everyone who is a disabled person. In the same way as not everybody who might be covered under this ground of protection would need to access severe disability benefit, or would need to access various of the services that are provided by health and social care for different groups of disabled people. So across government there are different sets of rules that aim to define a particular group of people who would benefit from a certain service or benefit. And think about it in a way like a reasonable adjustment. You know, a reasonable adjustment is designed to be the bridge that you need over the particular gap between you and inclusion. And these various services and support exist to plug specific gaps. So there is always going to be that difference between the protected ground, which is as broad as possible, and the specific services that are provided. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I'll try and. I mean, it was reasonably easy to understand, but I think that if I just add simply that discrimination legislation should include definitions based on rights, whereas legislation governing benefits should be based on need. And actually, that's where the first definitions of disability came out, the medical definitions, which most disability campaigners do not like at all when people try and apply them to rights legislation. It's quite possible and quite right that both have a place, and that's exactly what we have in Guernsey, and I think we can't change that. I think it's right. But a great question, very, very clever question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question online first, if that's okay, and then we'll go back to the room. Do members feel they could go further? So this is, ESS members feel they could go further with the proposals, e.g. the committee supported amendment, given the current groundswell of support and business community taking some of the pressure off by supporting the proposals as they stand. So i.e. they had to be watered down due to pushback. Some of that pushback has come off a little bit. Would you support going?
I think if you look at the letter that we received, that it was still not giving wholehearted support for the proposals. And I think that there will still possibly be some work behind the scenes to push for the Jersey legislation. So I think we would be foolish to sit on our laurels and think this is, and I've used this word before, a slam dunk. It's not a slam dunk. We have still got what I would regard as a battle ahead of us to change some minds of some deputies. So I still think that we may see some amendments to our proposals. So I think to change our proposals now and to widen the scope, we, as I say, I think that would be quite a dangerous thing. I think we would be criticised for saying, oh, you've changed again, you need to now consult again on these revised proposals, if it was the committee that brought something in. So I would be reluctant to do that. And as I say, I think there is some undercurrents of maybe some amendments coming through. I don't know, Em, if you think, that's my personal view.
No, I agree. If we had found ourselves in this position a year ago, the committee started out this term saying, look, a lot of the work that needs to be done around disability. We are planning to do that anyway because that's our first priority. So let's carry everyone else along with us and let's have this equality law that protects everyone. And when we set out, we believed that we could do that, and we had reasonable grounds to believe that. But we experienced such strong pushback through the consultation that we had to decide to focus in on a small number of priorities. And because we have promised to you for years and years and years that we the states have promised to you that we are going to bring in disability discrimination laws. We could not leave that behind just because it is the area where business resistance is strongest or where the most complex work needs to be done. So we had to make a decision some time ago now to focus in on this, it is, the decision would have had to be made at that point in time to continue with a broader scope or to narrow it down. That there is work that because of that decision hasn't been done that would have needed to be done between now and the debate, and it wouldn't be right for the committee to try and amend its own proposals, I don't think.
A couple more online. There was a question at the back. Thank you. Where's Mike? Sorry, Trudy. Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon. Brett first. Sorry. Sorry, Brett.
Hello. Right. In the UK, if you become disabled later on in life, you have a right to rehabilitation for your certain disability. And in Guernsey, the way it seems to be working is a lot of the carers are volunteers, and a lot of the work done with disabled people is run through charities, which is great, and we're very grateful. But can you imagine a situation where, with this new law, it wouldn't be left to just the charities? Do the states plan to have a scheme and money put aside for the rehabilitation of disabled people and the creating of jobs for rehabilitating people?
I can't talk on behalf of the government, but I can talk on.
Would we
Mike's becoming
be protected by the rights as well?
Well, so first of all, I'd better wait for the microphone. First of all, I should speak from the basis of what I know the convention says, and the convention requires governments to put in systems of habilitation and rehabilitation, and services to support those persons who have disabilities. This work should not rely on charity, because it reinforces a charity model of disability. So this is absolutely a government thing. Whether that would be challengeable under this legislation, I think I'd rather doubt that. And there might be some clever lawyer who could find a way of applying it, but and maybe the ESS can clarify that. But I don't think that the legislation, the discrimination legislation, would necessarily provide an easy route for that challenge. However, there might be a challenge under another route. I'm not sure. Perhaps, does anybody else mention?
I think we've got the Guernsey Employment Trust that does assist people with disabilities to to get into employment, and that is through a grant that is given to them. It's through Employment and Social Security that we give that grant. So they will be doing some of that work, but I don't think it is to the extent that you would be looking for. I think that's where it's really important that we fund the employment relations services and expand that, because actually a lot of this is evidence, so that we need the evidence, and without that, and to be quite honest, I think that's one area that we may get pushed back during the debate, is actually the funding. But that funding is really vital, and that benchmarking of knowing where we are now before we start, so that when we go and we can put forward proposals to the states, we can say, here's the evidence. So I think we're on a journey, and this is the start of the journey, but there is so much more that we need to do and we should be providing. Yeah. And I don't know if Em's got some more to add to that.
Well, Rob is right that you can't usually use a non-discrimination law to force a service to be provided that isn't being provided. So this isn't directly the route to expand services that may not currently exist, but it is an important part of the picture because because along with other things that we have been doing to raise awareness of disability and to push for inclusion, it puts this more at the forefront of states members' mind, and it puts the question of fair treatment at the forefront of states members' mind. But Mish really touched on the thing that's at the heart of it, and what we need what needs to be challenged and changed if you want to see a significant expansion in government services and services that are available effectively by right or by eligibility rather than by the grace of charity. At the heart of Guernsey politics, and at the heart of every election, is this idea that the public service is a waste of money, that we spend far too much money on it, and we need to be cutting back from that. And while that remains the dominant ideology in government, and it is and it has been for generations, you will not find a state that has the capability to significantly expand or improve the services that it provides. If anything, you will confront a state that is always looking to see whether things can be done differently, by which they mean less of, or too fewer people, and that it's a mindset change at the heart of the states that recognises that services such as the rehabilitation that you have talked about are fundamental to enabling people to enjoy and participate equally in island life as individuals, as workers, in all the roles that we all expect to be able to enjoy.
May I just add that once the legislation does go through, I'm being positive, when the legislation goes through, we can then really start work in earnest to get the UN Convention, the UK's ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to be extended to Guernsey. The effect of that will be that we will be monitored by the UN. So questions such as, do our rehabilitation services actually come up to scratch, will be absolutely in that review, and it will be open for the first time to the whole world to see how well Guernsey does in regard to respecting the rights of persons with disabilities. And I'm going to just take another 30 seconds just to go right back to the beginning to explain that the Guernsey Disability Alliance has not willingly compromised. I would say we've pragmatically compromised. Remember that who holds all the power in all this? Where is our power? Our power is in our voice, in your voice. We've got this far only because your voices have mattered. And the issue is that the voice of other people has been stronger, has been more persuasive and more powerful because money talks. And their argument has always been about money rather than rights. Although I would argue actually that respecting rights is a great way of increasing our economic prosperity as well as our social cohesion. And so I don't see the two as being diverse in any way. I just had to take a few seconds just to explain to you that we've taken a pragmatic decision on several things. But boy, I can tell you that has hurt horribly. But the legislation we've got, as it is workable. There are a couple of things that I would say are still not CRPD compliant, and we might find a way, I hope, to tweak them. But it would be a travesty if we let the perfect get in the way of the good.
And I would just like to add, because this is within the mandate of employment and social security, we do have some training budget, and we do, if people have specific skills and they need to have some training courses, we are able to provide that, and I can see Ed is nodding. So if there are specific cases, we are able to do that. And I think because of the unemployment situation that we've got at the moment, we'll be running a lot more skills-based courses. So that's the time for people to speak up and say, actually, this is what we need, and if we've got significant numbers, we can put those on, or sometimes we can do some bespoke if that's required. So that is the beauty of it sitting under our mandate, but that we have got some leeway in doing some of those things. So I hope that helps.
I'm conscious of the time, so anyone in the room is welcome to stay behind. I know we had a few questions and we can answer them. Unfortunately, our deputies need to get back to the chamber, but Rob just finished so beautifully, pretty much the whole finish, so thank you. The one thing that I really want to talk about, which I did, is your voice. So I've had a question on here that I think it's really good to finish with, is what can you do? So Emily alluded to the few things that we could all, not alluded, mentioned them. Can anyone remember what we can all do? Just check you've all been awake.
Write to your deputy.
Thanks, John. Right to your deputies, what else can we do?
Exercise your vote.
Exercise your vote. Tell your stories. Yeah.
Can I just say, if you just like to write to your deputies, you are more likely to get a response if you pose a question, ask for a response, or if you feel the need to do so, actually address it to that deputy. When deputies get generic, oh sorry.
So I'll repeat you. I'll repeat Jennifer in a sec.
Opposite when after 4 years' experience, sometimes deputies say, well, it was generic, so I didn't bother to respond. So either pose a question, ask for their thoughts or their opinions, or if you feel so inclined, just say, dear deputy, blah, blah, or have any priority, please consider this. And I think that will generate a better conversation potentially, or engagement, than the generic deputies at gov.2016, whatever it may be. So I just think, just from experience, I think that's, if you're able to do that, that's, I just wanted to put that out there, because
thank you.
A lot of deputies don't respond, and those are some of the reasons why, I believe.
So we need your voice. We've said that more than ever. So thank you. I know many people are weary. As I said before, it's been, for many people, it's a lifetime. For the GJA, it's 13 years. I'd like to finish on a positive, which is the 5 years, nearly 6 now, that I've been involved. The dedication of ESS in the last sort of 3.5 years since they've taken this on, or within this term, has been phenomenal. The amount of work that is produced in that time versus the amount of work that preceded that has been absolutely fantastic. So I've got down here compromise ×5, but Rob mentioned that there has been a lot of compromise, but we wouldn't be here today without that work. So I think we'd just like to finish with making a huge thank you to the officers and the deputies and everybody involved. Thank you.